loving talking with you guys and really learning about what life is like.
My dream is to give the rights, give the freedom to the women of my country.
How can I get married? It's everybody's right.
Your family or your freedom.
There's more to my story.
There's more to our story. There's more to my story.
Hey, I'm your host, Sarah Little, and you're listening to the More to Her Story podcast. You'll hear from journalists, thought leaders, social entrepreneurs, and of course, girls who are changing the game in their countries and communities. Thanks for choosing to be a part of the conversation, and I'll see you inside. Shudufhadzo Musida is a South African model and activist who was crowned Miss South Africa 2020. She's a dedicated advocate and spokeswoman for mental health awareness and women's rights. Shudu was recently appointed a regional champion for the United Nations Sexual and Reproductive Health Agency. Shudu and I met recently in Kigali, Rwanda, and I knew instantly that I wanted her to come on the show and share her wisdom. I hope you enjoy our conversation today.
So the first question, Shudu, that I ask all of my podcast guests is, how has your faith, and however you think about or conceptualize the word faith, shaped who you are and what you do in the world?
Oh, I think that's a really good question. I think my faith has made me realize that anything is absolutely possible. Because faith, and the definition of how I grew up to know it, was believing in things that you cannot see. So also believing in futures that we may have never really thought about, but knew that if we believe hard enough, anything is possible. So I am a product of the faith of my grandmother, my mother, and I am a culmination of all those prayers and all those hopes and dreams. So yeah, my faith is going to be, another chapter or even growth in the story of those that come after me. So that's how I look at faith.
That's so beautiful. That's powerful. Are you Christian? Were you raised Christian?
I was raised Christian. I often feel like the more we define, the different religions, the more we cause a divide. But I've been lucky enough, or taken the time rather, to read up a little bit on all the religions as defined. But to know the faiths and believe, and you see that there are more similarities than differences. So Christian is the definition, but ultimately I think I'm just a believer in God.
Yeah, for sure. Me too. Can you walk us through your background a little bit? What was your upbringing like in South Africa?
I grew up in a place that didn't have much, but made us feel so much, a place where the land around us and the people around us are enough to sustain us, because you know every single neighbor and you can go eat at any neighbor's house, and then you also get to play with your cousins and your friends on the dusty roads, and then get to eat literally mangoes or even avos from the yard at home. So the first 9 years of my life were very simple, where I grew up around very little, but it made me feel so happy. It made me feel so much. And then I moved to a mining town, so I was exposed to the whole mining thing. And then I moved to Johannesburg. And Johannesburg is where your question on faith and dreams comes in, where anything is possible. It's like a mini New York, like anything is possible.
You earned your degree at the University of Pretoria.
Yeah.
A great school. And before winning Miss South Africa, you were completing an honors degree in international relations.
Yeah.
I wonder, was your life trajectory like the average life trajectory for a girl growing up in South Africa?
No, the average girl, Black girl specifically, growing up in South Africa is different. The chances aren't as, or the access to opportunities or even access to education are not as open for young Black girls or young women of color to broaden it up. So education is a privilege, and it shouldn't be. Obviously, like your secondary and primary school education, that's a given because it's provided for. in the public schooling system. But in terms of university and getting an honors degree or even any degree at all, or higher learning institutions, it's not even a privilege. For some it's actually almost impossible. Majority of people that look like me.
After secondary and primary school, what is the average life trajectory for a young woman of color?
It's different for everyone, so I can't speak for everyone. I was lucky enough to get a scholarship, but my mom was a single mom, so even paying for my undergrad fees was almost nearly impossible, and then I had to take over in my last year to pay for it. But I think if you look at the East and Southern African region, which I've been lucky enough to learn more about as a regional champion for the UNFPA, is that teenage pregnancies are a big issue in Southern Africa. I mean, even in the village that I grew up in, if you don't go to school after high school, not even during high school, most of them get pregnant. After high school, definitely, if you're not going to school, the trajectory for your life is to be someone's wife, to be a mother. And then all those hopes and dreams then become null and void, you know. But the beauty of the world opening up and access to education and opportunities is that it makes women realize that they've got a choice. It makes women of color realize that they've got a choice and they can choose whatever trajectory they want for their lives, be it their sexual choices, their career choices, their bodily autonomy, whether or not they want to get married, and even if they want children, like knowing that they've got the right to healthcare. But the spectrum is big, because once one is denied access to education, it trickles down into many other facets of life and many other things that need to be addressed currently.
Why did you decide to compete for Miss South Africa?
Access to opportunities. I had the education, I had the degrees, but the truth is I was working in like retail, and there's nothing wrong with retail, but for what I studied, that was not the trajectory that I wanted for my life. And the biggest issue is that I didn't know the right people. I didn't have access to opportunities. So I entered Miss South Africa not to win, but rather to open myself up to a network of people who can see that I am smart, I am deserving of a job, I am deserving to sit at any table. So it wasn't about winning, it was just rather an opening to get the access to opportunities and networks.
And your biggest focal points during your time as Miss South Africa were mental health and women's rights, correct?
Yes.
Why was that?
Mental health was something that's often overlooked. I mean, if you look at, let me make an example of my village. If someone was living with anxiety, schizophrenia, depression, the first thing they say is that person is crazy. That they vilify the person, call them crazy, stupid, and even isolate them from different societies instead of addressing it for what it is. One knows that when you've got flu, you go to the doctor, and when you go to the doctor, they'll prescribe medication. You take some time off if need be to be better, and then you're good to go. But the same is not applied for mental health, which makes sense to me because there is no physical health without mental health. And as someone that had to deal with some challenges around that, it was so important for me to make sure that the people back home, the people around me felt seen, and also that mental health, at least at the very least, mental health conversations could be started so mental health could be prioritized. So it was my focus because I was Miss South Africa 2020 just after COVID. So it felt like something that was glaring in our faces, but we still just chose to, close our eyes because it makes us, basically puts a mirror in our faces, to really self-introspect about how we feel and to know that whatever we feel is okay and that there's always help, and vulnerability is okay. And women's rights, I chose that, gender equality, I chose that because of the women that raised me. You learn so much from the previous generations, but you also learn so much about the realities of so many women and how they're not given a seat at the table, they're not even given the rights and choices over their bodies, how some basic human rights for women are privileges. So it's important for me to shine a light on that so we can we can basically raise the next generation of young girls that have access to opportunities, but that realize that their voices matter. And when they get a seat at the table and there's no seat, we create one. We create spaces where women and girls can be heard.
Definitely. Speaking of gender equality, you were recently appointed a regional champion for UNFPA,
Yeah.
the United Nations Sexual and Reproductive Health Agency. Why, I mean, you've spoken a little bit about it, but why is UNFPA's mission so close to your heart? And why, like, what was the, like, did they approach you? Did you go to them? Like,
Funny enough, I met them in New York, and I was just there for a conversation. I was just there for a conversation because I really love their work and the work that the UN in its entirety does. And we sat and we spoke, and I told them about my work, and there was alignment there because I not only represent the other side of what education and access to opportunities can do, but I also represent the other side of without that, my age don't have, like I said, choices over their bodies and their bodily autonomy. Safe pregnancies are a privilege for so many people. Even their sexual and reproductive health rights, they don't even know what that is because from birth they're stripped of their bodily autonomy and the right to make choices over their bodies. So over and above that, just looking at the UNFPA's mission and the work that they did, it actually reminded me of the women in my village, in Venda, and the young girls, adolescent girls in my village, and the young women, and how this messaging and this advocacy and this work is so important because it doesn't only represent them and so many other girls and women, adolescent girls and women across East and Southern Africa, but it represents me.
yeah.
Yeah.
Shudu, what are some of the most significant challenges that women and girls face in South Africa today?
Safety. Someone said it feels like we're walking with a knife on our backs every single day, and if you're not careful, it might just hurt you. Sadly, South Africa is South Africa is my favorite place in the world. There's no place like it. When I'm away for too long, I miss it so much. But South Africa is not a safe space for women. And at least, I don't know, I don't want to make up stats, but I know from the women that I know and the conversations that social media has opened up that a lot of women have been abused at one point or another, be it verbally, physically, sexually. And that's the reality where we're even not okay with it, but it's almost like it's been normalized.
Mm-hmm.
You get me? It's not okay, but it's almost like it's been normalized. And those stories, some of us don't even speak about them.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, we just keep it going. But the way it affects us and the safety elements to it, So I think the biggest issue that South Africa is facing right now is basically not protecting women and girls enough.
Wow. And you studied politics, philosophy, and economics at uni. And so from a public policy perspective, what do you feel like the South African government could be doing more of to ensure the safety and protection of women and girls?
Let the government, let the system in itself and the leadership reflect the needs of women and girls. How do you have men making decisions about women and girls and there's no women at the table? And even if they're outnumbered, you find that there's just one or two for the sake of representation. I'm not just saying this for the South African government, but this is for so many governments around the world. People assume what women want. People assume what women need. But if we don't have enough voices, faces, ages reflected in the system, how do we expect to make a change when the people that are in power, and this is not just in South Africa, but the people that are in power are people that were there even when these laws that have basically violated the rights of women and girls have existed. It's only now when we fight for our rights and we show that we've got voices that people come to the party and speak and say, okay, cool, we do need to protect women and girls, but it's a no-brainer. It's supposed to be something that is prioritized because the number of people that die, the number of women and children that die from gender-based violence on a daily basis in South Africa is alarming. It's alarming. And those are just the cases reported. There's some that are not reported. The number of deaths of women from femicide is just it's appalling. And the crazy thing is that it almost causes like a trauma amongst women. I remember I think it was 2019, a girl, her name was Uyinene. She went to the post office to go drop off a package. She never came back. She was raped and she was killed.
Mm.
That started I think it's the MI Next movement in South Africa,
Mm.
where the MI Next movement was not just an act of activism against violence against women and girls in South Africa, but more of, please hear us, it could be me. And the crazy thing is, I felt like it could be me. I cried for so many days for someone I didn't know, because you realize that it could have been you. The spaces where we're supposed to be protected and seen and heard are the places where we are not. And that's all spaces.
Yeah.
So the question was, why are women not protected? Why do you hate us so much? So if you see the images, the march was so powerful. Thousands and thousands of women came out, not only just for her, but for themselves, their daughters. So I always feel like it shouldn't take something that extreme for policy to be changed and for governments to listen. But if those conversations are really prioritized and the right faces and the right people at the table, you'll ask women what they want instead of assuming what they want, because you are perpetuating a system that does not see their rights. And basically, their human rights have become privileges and things that can be negotiated. But the rights of women cannot be negotiated.
So I was talking to a South African friend of mine recently, actually, and he was just saying how the legacy and the remnants of apartheid is like they still very much exist today in South Africa. Like you can still feel them, and that makes sense. I mean, it was only the early 1990s that it came to an end. But how do you see the legacy of apartheid affecting young South Africans today?
Well, that's a very difficult question, because I would need to understand your friend's observation and where they were coming from in looking at that. I say this because a lot has changed, but I think the legacy in itself, obviously, it's not just an overnight thing. It brings about a lot of uncomfortable conversations, and also just knowing people whose family members died during that time. So it still looms and it still exists. How it affects young South Africans, I think maybe it's the equality gap. That's the biggest one. The equality gap, be it the different education system, or the right access to opportunities and education. That might be one. Access to opportunities, education, but also the reason why I entered Miss South Africa, the access to opportunities and networks aren't as readily available, because we're still trying to play catch up. Yes, the system has been built or changed now to make sure that there's equality, but there's a lot, there's a lot that still needs to happen. And this is where mental health comes in again. Generational trauma is a real thing. So once those real conversations are had, instead of running away from them, and we've done that in South Africa, but I think in terms of young people, yes, they have more opportunities than those that came before them, but it is still a catch-up game, because you can't catch up so many years in just 28 now. 28, yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
No, 29 years, sorry, 29 years.
Yeah, and he was, he's a white male South African, so he's obviously coming at it from a different perspective. But I was just, I was telling him that I was interviewing you, and he was like, "I would love to hear her perspective, like on what she experiences." But
I'll be the first one to admit that the reason why it's very hard for me to answer the question is because I have access to opportunities because of even platforms like Miss South Africa, but it's not lost on me that I would fall on the privileged side of this conversation as well. So I would need to understand his perspective to make sure that it's a well-balanced thing. So that was just like a very personal opinion. But I'd really need to think about it. I'm sure it's more complex than that.
Shudu, what are your goals and dreams? Like, what is in store for you in your career at this point in time?
A lot actually. I think it's more freedom over my time, and freedom over my time. my goal has always been to create seats that went there before, not for myself only, but for women and girls who try and they knock on so many doors, right? But there's this power and strength that we have and ability to use our agency to actually reshape the narratives that currently exist. Yeah. So I like there's a lot that's on the cards. But it's basically the continuation of making sure that legacy is solidified through my work, through my advocacies, and basically being of service to humanity. Yeah.
All things which you're doing very well. What is your message to young women and girls around the world?
I know this sounds very, I'm not even endorsing them. This sounds very L'Oreal-y, but my message is that we are worth it, but we are worth so much more. And I say this because that's the message that my 9-year-old self would have wanted to hear, that I'm good enough. I think imposter syndrome is something that we don't really speak about, even when the doors are open and the seats are given at the table for women and girls. That even when you're given a seat, you know that you're worth that seat. You know that you're good enough for that seat. So I would say that you're good enough, or you're worth it, and you deserve everything that you want. Yeah, that's my message.
That's awesome. And so I end all of my interviews on a question that's a bit unconventional. It's, what is the more to your story? This podcast is called More to Her Story. The platform that I run is called More to Her Story. There's more to everyone's story than we can see on the surface. So what is the more to your story, Shudu?
The more to my story is being okay with being happy. Because I think because of where most of us may come from, we constantly work so hard, to survive, to be the best, to thrive once we get to the other side. But we forget to be happy in the process. Someone taught me that I need to rest as much as I work, rest as hard as I work, because I thought it was the opposite. If I work hard enough, that will be the thing that makes me enough and get people to see me. But you know what? Even when you get to the other side, the more is being happy. Yeah. So the more is being okay with being happy.
Well, happiness looks good on you, so.
Thank you.
This conversation ends here, but we don't have to stop talking. Go to moretoherstory.org or follow us on Instagram at moretoherstoryofficial. And don't forget to check back in twice a month for new episodes. Thanks for listening.